welcome to the second episode of the Willard Preacher podcast. I'm Matt, and with me is again Gary, known as the Willard Preacher, who's been out on the campus of Penn State for the last 40 years, preaching to the students outside of the Willard building and engaging in discussion of all types, especially with regards to how one might come to know God and what is the nature of truth and all these sorts of things. So here we are, episode 2. So last time we sort of introduced a few things, but now I don't know, we're just going to kind of keep the conversation going. So I think maybe the thing to do is to ask Gary anything of note in the last week. We've, since we last recorded our first episode, I think you've been on campus 5 or 6 days. So anything interesting going on out there lately?
Actually, we did have some fun on Friday. On Friday, this group, I think they were a Baptist group. They were high school kids. And this lady came up to me, and I don't know if she was a teacher or a parent or whatever, but they'd come up to Penn State to look at the nuclear reactor. And she stopped by and she said, well, I used to be here back in the 90s, and I just wanted to see if you were still here, and maybe bring my class by to listen to you. So her class was there, and it was about 2 o'clock, maybe 2:05, and the next class change was 2:15. I usually do a Friday speech, which I didn't think was appropriate for high school kids, so we kind of chucked that, went with other things. So we did some moral things. We did, all the things that we normally do. And Karen had been up. Karen's my wife, for those of you who don't know. And she had been up. She had a break from work. She was working downtown at a bank. And she started talking to some of these kids while I was preaching. And somehow they got on. And of course, these are Baptist, Protestant kids and teachers and stuff. And so they got on. Somehow she got them on Orthodoxy. So I was done and I came over and she said, well, you take it from here. And she left. So we had a long discussion, maybe a half an hour, not that long, I guess, maybe a half an hour, 40 minutes, mostly with one of the students. He's 11th grader, very smart kid, knew what he was talking about. Some of the other teachers chimed in, some of the other students chimed in. He took most of it. And it was mostly about sola scriptura, the Bible alone. And so we went over this whole thing about the church is the pillar on the ground of truth, and follow the tradition, whether written or oral. And he was, they were trying to say, well, no, it's all about the scriptures and the scriptures alone. And I was trying to say, well, no, there weren't any scriptures back then, so they couldn't have been scriptures alone. And so they always point to this one scripture that talks about the scriptures are inspired by God and profitable for certain things. So I try to take them back. Maybe we can do this one day if we talk about Protestantism. I try to take them back a few verses before that, where Paul says to Timothy, follow my doctrine. And you know that you're following the truth because you know who you've heard it from, and you have the Holy Scriptures. Mm-hmm. So it isn't just the Scriptures, it's the Scriptures and getting it from Paul and getting it from the tradition. So that lasted for a half an hour, 40 minutes, and then they had to go. But that was a good interaction. Mm-hmm. Hopefully it had good effects on them. I don't know. They were pretty entrenched in their position. Of course, I was entrenched in mine. But hopefully, something got through. And today we had a nice discussion with somebody. He's not an atheist. He's looking for God, but he wanted to hear ideas about evidence for God. Because I tell him, there isn't any reasoning you can do to know who God is, but there is reasoning you can do to point that there is a God. So he wanted to know that. So we had a nice discussion with him. Other than that, it was just kind of the normal stuff, the normal preaching.
Well, good. So maybe that's a nice segue, because one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, maybe to expand upon, because I think it was certainly helpful to me in my time as a college student to sort of hear how you laid things out. So when we had talked the last time, you said something similar to what you just said, which is that someone could reasonably reason to the existence of a God. not necessarily who that God is, but there should be certain things that we look at that should indicate to us that there very well it could be or is a God. So what are some of those things? Where would we start with that kind of discussion?
Well, what I was telling the guy today, and he agreed on this actually after it was all over, but I think the best evidence for God's existence is objective morality. That we all know that objective morality exists. So objective morality, for anybody who doesn't know, is something is wrong for everybody no matter what. It's subjective morality is more like pro-choice. I wouldn't do it. Somebody else wants to do it. That's all right with me. It's just my own personal morals. Objective morals is something is wrong for everybody no matter what. And we all know that exists, and we all act as if that exists. Anytime that you look at something, like if you're watching TV and you're watching the news or something, and some guy goes in and he shoots up an elementary school, and you think that's wrong, you've just expressed objective morality, because it's not just a societal thing, which you can agree or disagree on. You're saying that's wrong. No matter what, that was wrong. So as soon as you do that, you're saying there's some sort of cosmic law, some sort of law coming down from the heavens that says this is wrong for everybody no matter what. That's what we mean by objective morals. Well, objective morals can't exist without God. And so it's one of I think, the more clear expressions of God. So how I tried to explain it to the person today was there's two ways of kind of going about it. The first one is this kind of straightforward way. Morality is a concept of the mind, right? It's not a physical thing. There's no morality bush to go get morality from. It's a concept of the mind. So you see something happening, see somebody getting stabbed, see somebody robbing a store, you think that's wrong, but it's in your head. The action is just an action. What's in your head is the morality. So it's a concept of the mind. So if there's no mind there, there's no morality there. So let's say there's no God, and the Big Bang happens. Well, there's no mind there, so there's no morality. So the first cell, there's no morality there because there's no mind there. The first fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal, might be a brain there, but not one that can conceive of morality, not a rational mind that can conceive of morality. So all the way up to that point, there's no morality at all. Man comes on the scene. Man now has the ability to rationalize, to think, to come up with morals. So at that point, man just makes up the concept of morality. So if there's no God, even the concept of morality is just made up. And then he fills in the specifics any way he wants to. So if there's no God, we can just throw away the very concept of morality if we want. And if we keep the concept, we can change the specifics any way we want to. So there's no objective morality if there's no God. But we know that there is. And the other way I like to go about this, and I did this with him today, is do role playing. So we say, okay, let's say there's no God. I think I'm pretty generous in that. Don't usually do that, but we say there's no God. And so I'll say I like to rape 2-year-olds, right? That's the one I usually use. It's a little gross, but it's not one of those things that you can say, maybe there's a time when raping 2-year-olds might be good, right? Everybody knows it's wrong. Everybody knows it's wrong all the time. So when I do this with an atheist, they usually start out by saying, well, you don't need objective morality. You don't need a God for objective morality. Everybody knows this is wrong. Everybody knows these things are wrong. You don't need a God for that. So I say, okay, well, then let's role play. We'll say there's no God. I'll say I like to rape 2-year-olds. I don't care what you like to do. I don't care what your friends like to do. I like to rape 2-year-olds. Why am I wrong? So they usually start out with the obvious, and this is where the guy started out today. It hurts the 2-year-old. I say, yeah, okay, that's right. But why is that wrong? That usually takes them aback because they just assume it's wrong, but you just stated a fact. It hurts the 2-year-old. You haven't told me why it's wrong to hurt the 2-year-old. You've just said that it does, and you're assuming that it's wrong. Well, I'm not assuming it's wrong. I'm assuming it's right. So why are you right and I'm wrong? So then sometimes they'll go, well, if we just everyone starts hurting each other, then society becomes confused, dangerous, everyone, but basically a dangerous society. And then, so that's true. It's another truth, right?
Mhm.
Becomes dangerous. But why is that wrong? Okay, you're stating a truth, but you're not telling me why it's wrong. Why the society being a dangerous society is wrong. So then they might say, but if it continues this and everybody starts hurting each other and killing each other, then eventually the whole human race could go extinct. I said, okay, well, that's a fact. Why is that wrong? And eventually they get to, well, sometimes they might say, well, it's wrong because society says it's wrong. Well, the question then is society always right? And the answer is no, society's not always right. But they might bring up the philosopher, say, well, this philosopher, Kant's categorical imperative or something they come up with, at least they used to, and say, well, Kant, this philosophy says it's wrong. Okay, but if I disagree with Kant's presuppositions, then I'm going to disagree with his conclusions. So that's not an absolute. That's his opinion based on his propositions or his presuppositions. Mm-hmm. So we say, okay, then eventually they get to this place where they realize, well, okay, I guess I do need God for objective morality. Now, they have a choice. They can say, okay, well, a few minutes ago I said you can have objective morality, and I believe in objective morality, but you don't need a God for it. Now I realize that you do. So now I have a choice. I can say there's a God because I believe in objective morality. Or I can say there's no such thing as objective morality and say all morality is subjective. And every single time, without fail, every atheist always ends up by saying there's no such thing as objective morality. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately, the atheist isn't looking for truth. He doesn't want there to be a God. Right. So he'll change his beliefs on the fly like that if he thinks that his previous beliefs led him to a God. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's the and going back a second to the going extinct, of the society going extinct, and why that's wrong. In an evolutionary, chain of events, a godless evolutionary chain of events, if a species comes into existence, it's neither good nor bad. It just happened. If that species goes out of existence, it's neither good nor bad. It just happened. So in a godless evolutionary chain of events, humanity comes into existence, it's neither good nor bad. It's just something that happened. Yeah. If humanity goes out of existence, it's neither good nor bad. It's just something that happened. Right? So ultimately, they do have to get to this point where they either have to accept God because there's objective morality, or they have to say there's no objective morality. And they all go with no objective morality, even though they can't live that way. Yeah. Even though they will say when they're watching the news, that was wrong. They can't live that way. Mm-hmm. They'll do that because they want to stay atheist. But I think that he agreed, this guy today agreed that was the best evidence he's heard for a God. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know I can remember encountering that line of thought when I was a student. And yeah, that was really gripping because I thought, well, gosh, I know for sure murder's wrong. I know for sure, rape is wrong. I know for sure a lot of things are wrong. But yeah, it makes sense because if you are just saying that we're here by accident, and what really is so different from with us than a single-celled organism or even a member of the animal kingdom, in which case, those are just things that animals do. And so this idea of it actually being wrong if we're just here by accident, that is just something that is a figment of our imagination ultimately. I don't know that I necessarily witnessed someone sort of just completely caving like that and then basically saying, yeah, I guess there isn't after all that there isn't objective morality. There's something kind of honest about that. At least, if you follow that along, at least you're willing to say, well, I guess there isn't. But like you said, no one lives that way, and especially, Yeah, just no one lives that way. You might encounter someone who has a different opinion or a political rival or something, and that person's wrong, or that person's terrible, or that person's evil. Well, you're expressing a moral viewpoint, but you need the transcendent in order for that to be the case.
Yeah, and sometimes it takes them a while. Sometimes they'll be like, it takes them a few days, a few times of coming back before they finally admit to it. But they do all finally admit to it. But then they say, well, I guess there's no such thing as objective moral. But you can always catch them if they're around long enough. They're eventually going to say, oh, well, that's wrong. And so, well, that's just, you have to understand what I'm saying. I'm saying it's wrong, but it's not really, and they try to backtrack or whatever.
Yeah.
But ultimately, because you can't get away from it. And the whole justice system collapses, right?
Right.
When somebody's brought into court for murder, we don't say, okay, well, you murdered these 4 children, but we're not saying it's wrong. We're just saying, if you're guilty, we're going to throw you in jail because we don't like it. We're not saying it's wrong. It's like, we don't like eating peas. So if you ate peas, we're going to throw you in jail. Not that it's wrong to eat peas, but we're going to throw you in jail because we don't like it. It's the same sort of thing. But everybody, even though sometimes atheists will try to say the justice system works that way, because they always live in a fantasy world. They don't live in the real world. Everybody knows the justice system doesn't work that way. We bring somebody up murdering for four or five kids. We know that this was wrong, objectively wrong. And if they did it, they need to go to jail because they did wrong. That's the real world. Right. They always try to live in this fantasy world. Well, no, it wasn't really wrong. It's just, we just say it's wrong, but that's not the world in which we live.
That's right.
So if your beliefs have any chance of being right, they have to accurately explain the world in which we live. You can't just make up a fantasy world and say, well, that's the real world. Right. So you have to be honest with what the world in which we live is, and then you have to say, okay, does my beliefs, does my ideology, does it explain the real world?
Right. Yeah, and I think what was compelling for me is I knew that I was going to have to violate something within myself. Just because, like you said, if you were to witness something like this, you wouldn't sit and think, is that wrong for me? That's wrong for me. I wonder if it's wrong for them. You don't think in those terms. You think that is wrong. It's I don't know. Of course, it certainly, once you bail on the idea of there being objective morality, then you basically have to say, like, every atrocity in history, right, is not really wrong. It's just something that the society has sort of come together to agree about. You end up basically having to, like, equivocate on slavery and Hitler and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, Hitler and Stalin and the tens of millions of people that have been killed in communism and atheism and so on. And that's why it's so easy to do that in atheistic society. Because ultimately the leaders at least know that there's nothing right or wrong. There's no judgment. There's no calling to account in the end. And nothing's right or wrong anyhow. So why not just kill everybody?
Right.
So that's the problem. Once you leave God, there's just nothing there to keep you in any sort of moral, unless you want to. So a godless society, which we basically are now, it could go to the heights of a Christian morality if it wanted to, and it can go to the depths of Stalin and Hitler and these guys too. There's nothing keeping it from going either direction. In a Christian society, when I stand out at Willard, it's on a concrete, kind of patio, and there's these concrete slabs, and with definite markers on them, definite, boundaries. And I stand inside of that and say, in a Christian society, yes, you can step over those boundaries. Those boundaries are there, and they'll call you back, or the people can rise up and say, you stepped over the boundaries. But in a secular society or an atheistic society, there's no boundaries there. You can just erase them. They're just all erased. And you can erase them and put them in anywhere you want. You can have them there for a while, and you can erase them and redraw them. So there's nothing stopping a secular society such as ours, much less an atheist or communist society or whatever, of going any direction. That's what makes it so, I don't know, frightening is the right word, but so concerning of the college students today, because they don't have a boundary like that. They don't have a God and a religion that says these are the boundaries. So they just follow the leader. Okay, this is what you're telling me. All right. Even if I disagree with it, I'm not going to say anything.
Hmm.
So because I don't know, nobody knows. So they're set up just to follow the leader. Whatever the leader says, they're set up for that. And so the society, once maybe the generations in front of them leave, there's nothing there. If they continue on this and the ones behind them continue on it, there's nothing to stop the society going any direction it wants to, but from the greatest to the worst. And usually it's the worst.
Hmm.
Usually when you don't have God there, we don't have those drawn lines in the concrete. It almost always goes to the worst.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And it's an interesting thing that, as Americans, we probably look at historical, let's say, monarchies, and with those monarchies, to the degree that they are understood that like those kings or queens or emperors or whoever are put in place by God, we think of that as being like the height of tyranny, and we're so free and we elect our own people and so on. But the truth of the matter is, um, just like you see in its fullest expression with, these atheistic communistic regimes, if there's no actual understanding that God is setting the standard, then that society can go anywhere. We're probably going in that similar type of direction, maybe more slowly, because we sort of have a sense that, I don't know, that um, maybe we as good people sort of have some boundaries or something like that. But there really isn't anything standing in our way because we ultimately don't allow God to guide us or to set those standards.
Yeah, we older folk, we still
Mm-hmm.
have this remembrance of Christianity, even the ones that aren't very Christian. The young ones don't. They don't have any remembrance of Christianity. So, again, you can take them any direction that you want, and they're just going to follow. That's just the way it's going to be. And unless we come back to God, who knows where we're going to end up?
Right. Yeah, and I guess some folks might even make the argument that, like, on one hand, we were fortunate to have a Christian heritage, and you know that sort of uh, that sort of foundation. But on the other hand, when our founding documents say "we the people," that's basically setting the standard right there. That we're the ones making the decision, and eventually it's probably not going to go in the right direction.
Yeah, we basically, our system is set up from the Enlightenment. We had a Christian people, a Protestant Christian people, which kept things under control. But the system was not, like you said, it wasn't a monarch. It was supposed to protect the Christianity of the nation, the orthodoxy of the nation, let's say, in an Orthodox country. So it was just we the people, because that's what the Enlightenment was. The Enlightenment went from, well, we find truth by revelation. God has revealed the truth. To everything now starts with man.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
you got. I think, therefore I am. Well, even if he tried to reason to God, it really doesn't matter because the Enlightenment set the stage for everything starting with man.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is maybe in the beginning they thought you could reason to Christianity, but then eventually they found out that you can't. And that's why we are where we are today, saying you can't know who God is. You can't know what the right religion is because we start with man and we try to reason. And you try to tell people, well, no, you have to get revelation from God. You have to seek God. God has to reveal it. God has to make it known. And they have no understanding what you're talking about. I think, well, what
Mm-hmm.
language am I taking? Which one of these words don't you understand? God has to let it be known. They just look at you like, what do you mean? How does that work? Because they don't have any conception of that. It's
Mm-hmm.
all reasoning. Reasoning may be able to get you to God, but it can't get you to who the God is and what the right religion is. And so that's why we are where we're at. And now that's why we have transgenderism, homosexuality, abortion and fornicating and drunk and all this stuff is okay because we've started with man. Now man gets to make up the rules.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you don't know where it's going to end up. Well, I think we know where it's going to end up. It's going to end up bad, but
Yeah.
how long it's going to take to get there, I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, like I said, that was probably this idea of objective morality, and therefore, the necessity of a transcendent God for that. That was really compelling for me. Is there anything else, any other I mean, I agree. That's such a clear pathway. Is there any other things that you point out as far as, that someone might be able to, like you said, reason to the existence of God, even if they don't know who it is?
Well, the other one, another one of the ones I tried today was the creation.
Mm-hmm.
You have the creation. That's a difficult one because Big Bang, abiogenesis, evolution, that's so ingrained
Mm-hmm.
in students today and in people today that it's hard for them to think other than that. The closest they might get is God started it and then it evolved or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But so, I mean, there's some simple things, some common sense things, right? If a bird's nest needs a creator,
Right.
why doesn't a universe and all the life in it need a creator? A beehive, an anthill, groundhog tunnels, beaver dams, all these very simple things need a creator. But then you're telling me a universe and all the life in it can just happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the secular scientist creation myth, right? They say to us as Christians, they say, well, you guys, you're so simplistic. You don't understand what happens. You just say God did it. All right, well, there's obviously truth in that, right? We say
Mm-hmm.
God did it.
Sure.
But you could turn that around and say, well, you guys are so simplistic. You say stuff happens.
Yeah.
So what's more consistent with life we find around us? Somebody creates or stuff just happens.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're walking through the woods, this is an example I heard many years ago, but if you're walking through the woods and you're on a path and you see a number of twigs put together to spell the word love, simple 4-letter word, do you think, look what natural forces did? Do you think, look what a deer did? Look what whatever the animals in the woods, a squirrel did? No, you think, what did a human being who's old enough to get around, ambulatory enough to get around, gather twigs, knows how to spell, put them together?
Mm-hmm.
But a universe and all the life in it just happened.
That's right.
Right. So that aspect of it, just on a common sense level, doesn't make sense. But here's what happened, as far as I understand it. Scientists at some point in time said, we're not going to bring God into science. Right? It wasn't always that way. But probably sometime after the Enlightenment around there, they said, we're not going to bring God into science. You can't bring God into science. He said, well, why not? Well, you can't test for God. Okay, somewhat obvious, kind of dumb, but somewhat obvious. Of course, you can't test for God, right? But why can't you use the scientific method, study the universe and all the life in it, and come to the conclusion it couldn't have happened on its own?
Yeah.
That's a reasonable conclusion to come to.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as you do that, you've brought God into science. So they start out by saying, no, you can't do that. Can't bring God into science. So I usually try to tell the students that scientists, that the myth is scientists have no agenda, no belief system. They're just out there looking at the evidence, seeing where it naturally leads. And so if you have a consensus of the scientists, it must be true. I say, no, scientists do have a belief system. They do have an agenda. And they look at me like I'm crazy. And they tell me I'm crazy. But when I tell them what it is, they all say, oh, well, yeah, of course. But that matters because their belief system is naturalism. Mm-hmm. They believe that because once you say you can't bring God into science, you're left with naturalism. That's all you got. You can't go any other direction. That's what you have. So that's the belief system. Those are the tinted glasses they're seeing all the evidence through. So you and I see all the evidence through, Orthodox Christianity. They see all the evidence through naturalism. Mm-hmm. And they interpret all the evidence through naturalism, right? So let's see if we can give an example here. So let's say the fossil record, all right? So there's two things that the fossil record, everybody agrees on. Dead things, and there's a certain interrelatedness of all things. So what colored glasses do you have on? If you have the secular scientist colored glasses, you say, okay, interrelatedness of all things, there must be common ancestors. But if you have the Orthodox Christian glasses on, you say interrelatedness of all things, there must be a common God. Mm-hmm. So who's right? The person who's right is the person who has the right presupposition.
That's right.
Because all the evidence is the same, the fossil record, all the evidence is there. And you'll see Christians who are scientists debating with secular scientists all day long, and they're never going to come to an agreement because they have different starting points. So the important thing is, and this is what I tried to drive home today, was what matters is there a God? Who is he? And what did he do?
Mm-hmm.
If there is one, that's how you know, because nobody was there to see it. You can't. So the first step of the scientific method is observation. Nobody was there to see it. You can't reproduce it. You can't experiment on it. So the evidence you have is what we have here, and we're all seeing it through different colored glasses. So what happens is they say you can't teach religion in schools, so you can't teach the creation story of the Christians in school, even from a scientific perspective. You can't teach it.
Mm-hmm.
So they're only getting one side of the story. So I think that must be it. And these scientists don't have an agenda. They don't have a belief system. So this has to be true. So let's give a couple of examples. So let's say God creates Adam and Eve right here, right now. So they probably looked like they were 18, 20 years old when he created them. So 10 minutes pass. A secular scientist comes up. And he said, how old are Adam and Eve? Oh, well, they're 20 years old. No, they're 10 years old. Oh, you're trying to trick me. You're just trying to trick me. I'm not trying to trick you. You have the wrong presupposition.
Mm-hmm.
You believe in naturalism, and this didn't happen by naturalism. Or you have a star 20 million light years away or whatever. And they say, you see, that star has to be a minimum of 20 million years old because naturalism says that light came naturally to the Earth. It took 20 million years, and so it's at least 20 million years old. All right, well, what if God created it visible on the Earth from the beginning?
Mm-hmm.
Then who knows how old that? You have to know how old, how long ago God created before you can know how old that star is. So who's right? Whoever has the right colored glasses on is right.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll say something like, well, but you've got the breakdown of these elements from uranium to lead or whatever, and has a certain half-life and all this sort of stuff. And that's true. But did this break down at the same rate from the beginning? Was the world a paradise in the beginning?
Mm-hmm.
There was no breaking down at all. Then you got the fall, and now it starts to break down. Well, did it break down really quickly and then slow down? Or has it broke down at the same level, at the same rate forever?
Mm-hmm.
Well, is there a God or not?
Yep.
Who is he? If there's no God, okay, the secularists are probably right. If there is a God, then the Christians are probably right. But you have to know that first. It all comes down to, is there a God or not? If so, who is he? What's he want from us? How did he do things? He was there. Mm-hmm. He knows. So the guy today said, well, what if you believe that God started everything out and created everything to evolve the way it did? So well, that's fine. That's still not the scientific creation myth. Mm-hmm. Scientific creation is not that God created it to work like that. Mm-hmm. Scientific creation myth is stuff just happens. So yes, that wouldn't be the Christian view of things, but it wouldn't be the scientific view of things either.
That's right. Yep.
So that's, I think, some of the problems with the scientific viewpoint. And I think that the creation viewpoint, apart from, the scriptures and everything, just is common sense. That's the way mm-hmm. things work. Simple mm-hmm. things don't come about by chance.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we don't, I spent some years teaching biology and teaching aspects of evolution. And my experience related to that is the more closely you look at it, especially over a long period of time, you realize that the odds are just staggering, and in which case, you start thinking about how complex is the genetic code, and everything in that has to work perfectly in order for someone to be a healthy human being. What are the odds of that when you have 3.5 billion letters of your DNA? So yeah, you're basically standing. You're just insisting, because of your presuppositions. You're insisting on these absolutely staggering odds. And
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, just and like you said, and completely contrary to anything you've ever observed, setting aside even the idea that like you said, you can't go back in time and observe these things happening, but even in your day-to-day experience, name one time that you've ever seen something emerge like this, and you can't.
No, and that should be a really telling thing. It doesn't happen in real life, because what the scientists are doing, basically, since they didn't see it happening, all right, they see the universe expanding, let's say, assuming that's true, see the universe expanding. So then they say, well, if naturalism is true and the universe is expanding, it must have been really tied together at one point, and then it must have expanded really quickly. And this has been a long time since I looked into this, but if I remember correctly, they say in the first, and I don't know what they call this, but it's like a nanosecond, the shortest period of time you can think of. They say more had to happen in that very short period of time than in all the time of the rest of the universe has been around, which I think is billions of years. The reason they say that is because that's what they had to do to get the math to work.
Right.
Okay, so you did it to get the math to work. Does that mean it's true? No, it just means the math worked. So there's a quote I saw on the Science Channel many years ago now, and I think it was by Hawking. And he said, there's three, and he meant naturalistic, there's three naturalistic theories as to how the universe began. We can get the math to work out for all three, but which one is right? So it doesn't matter that you can get the math to work out, it can still be wrong. Because how are you supposed to test whether that much can happen in that short a period of time? How are you supposed to test, and then from the initial expansion, if all these things can work out just perfectly? There's no way to test it. So what you do is you just tell stories. Right? We've never seen a fish evolve into amphibian. So what do? We tell a story. Okay, if naturalism is true, your story's probably pretty close. But what if naturalism isn't true?
Right.
But they don't teach students to ask that question. They just say, okay, well, that story sounds plausible. But we don't know if it's plausible or not because we've never seen it. But okay, it sounds plausible. It's a nice story. There's lots of nice stories out there. But how do you know it happened? And unless you know whether there's a God or not, and who he is and what he did if he's there, you don't know. You're just guessing.
Right. Absolutely.
But you say it's science, and everybody says, "Oh, okay."
Yeah. And the truth of the matter is actually that the more you dig into these things, the more you realize that, it is not uncommon for the scientific consensus to run up into a barrier and then create another story for how that barrier was overcome, So for example, the odds against like even a single-celled organism coming about spontaneously is just staggering. So you will often encounter these stories about, okay, well, the first life more than likely then came from asteroids from some other planet that then landed here and seeded all of life, So that's just kicking the can down the road a little bit, because you then wonder, well, where did that single-celled organism or whatever come from, from outside of our solar system or whatever. But nevertheless, it's like it's an acknowledgement that these things really don't add up, and yet there's no point in there where someone says, well, this just doesn't add up. No, we're going to insist on our presupposition and try to patch it together. There's all sorts of things that, like, for example, I taught astronomy, and what you realize is there's no explanation for how a star comes into existence in a naturalistic way without there being a previous star in existence. So like you basically need the energy from another star like exploding for another star then to coalesce and form. Well,
Yeah,
then the question is, well, how do you ever get that first star?
Right.
Well, we just don't have, there's tons of different things where things are basically violating basic observable laws of thermodynamics and other things. Things should tend towards disorder, and yet they become locally more organized. So like you said, it's all about the presupposition. You just need to get to that if you're going to be honest about it.
Yeah, and sometimes we as Christians, we kind of play into this a little bit because we play the God of the gaps game. So we say, okay, well, we give scientists too much credit. So we say, okay, well, they've explained this and this and this, but they can't explain that. So that must be where God comes in. But then they explain that. So we say, well, they do this. Well, then they can't explain that. So then they explain that.
Mhm.
So they've got us pushed back all the way to before the Big Bang.
Right.
Right. But right before the Big Bang, God must have done something.
Yeah.
What if they figure that one out? What if they tell us a nice story for that one? Right. So, you know, that's the game that we play that that gets us in trouble. What we need to do is say, okay, well, the scientists can explain what happens in the natural. So they can explain, you know, the process for a tree getting nutrients out of the ground. So then they say, you see, we don't need God. Well, how do you know God was not involved in that process? Scientists have gone way beyond their discipline. Their discipline is to explain what happens in the natural world. How does it work?
Mm-hmm.
The discipline is not to say whether God is there or not, because they don't know that. So God could be necessary for all, we would say God is in everything, you know, so God is necessary for all these things to work. And if God pulls back, everything collapses, everything goes back to non-being.
Mm-hmm.
So, but we as Christians, we play that game and we try to play the naturalistic game and beat them at the naturalistic game, right? But you don't have to do that because the naturalistic game is a loser and you're going to end up losing.
Yeah.
If you play that game, because that game's a losing game to play. So sometimes then they'll say, oh, I just lost that. And yeah. They'll say, you as Christians, you're stuck in the mud, right? You have your doctrines and you're just going to believe those doctrines no matter how much evidence we give you. But we scientists, or they'll say the scientists if they're a student, you know, if you give them evidence to disprove a theory, they'll allow that theory to be disproved and they'll move on to another one, as grudgingly as they may do it, and they do that. Mm-hmm. But then they turn around and so they're telling us that scientists can be wrong. Then they turn around and say, but you can't go against the science. This is the science mm-hmm. of evolution and Big Bang and all. So that's the science. How can you go against the science? Well, you just told me they can be wrong. That's why I can go against them. If they're infallible, if they're not infallible, they can be wrong. And so mm-hmm. that's fair game to go against them. So they try to play both sides of the fence there. So anyhow, there was another one. I'll come up with it eventually.
Well, yeah. And what's interesting there is, I think maybe what is most helpful is to point out those places where, you know, like you said, if the scientific community was strictly looking at, here's the things that we directly observe, and here's how we're trying to put these together and understand them, that's fine. But they're clearly stepping into metaphysical statements, right? You know, they're saying that we cannot talk about the influence of another level of reality. We can't talk about anything but the natural world. That's a metaphysical statement. And you know, so what business do they have actually? If your purview is the physical world, what business do you have to then make metaphysical statements?
Right.
You know, but you know, Stephen Hawking was great about that, you know, declaring there to be no God and things of that nature. It's like, well, right. All right, stay in your lane, buddy.
Stephen, how do you know that one? That's a pretty good one.
Yeah.
So here's what scientific observation really leads to, right? I do this with atheists all the time. They don't like it. You can tell me if I'm off my rocker or whatever. So we've never seen life coming from non-life, right? We've always seen life coming from life. So that's the evidence that we have currently. That if the evidence changes, our conclusion can change. But that's the evidence we have right now. And that's how my perception of science is. They go with the evidence that they have until new evidence comes in to change it. Mm-hmm. So we've only ever seen life coming from life. Where did the first material life come from? As far as the evidence is concerned, it couldn't have come from another material life, because then that wouldn't be the first one. Mm-hmm. The only other option is an immaterial life, right? Mm-hmm. So, and until you can show life coming from non-life, the evidence shows life coming from life. So the first material life had to come from another life. And the only other way that could happen is if it's an immaterial life. Mm-hmm. Now you can do the same thing with intelligent life. Mm-hmm. We've never seen intelligent life coming from non-intelligent life. Right? We've only seen intelligent life coming from intelligent life. So that's where the evidence lies. The evidence states that intelligent life always comes from intelligent life. Until we find differently, That's where the evidence is. So where did the first intelligent material life come from? Had to come from an immaterial intelligent life. That's where the evidence shows us. You do the same thing with self-aware life. Self-aware life always comes from self-aware life. Never seen it come from non-self-aware life. So the evidence doesn't show us that it comes from non-self-aware life. It only shows us it comes from self-aware life. So then where did the first material self-aware life come from? The only other option is an immaterial self-aware life. So you put all those three together and you ask, where did the first intelligent self-aware life come from? Well, the evidence points to an immaterial self-aware intelligent life. All right. Now, atheists won't accept that because they have this great faith that eventually we're going to see life coming from non-life. But eventually we're going to see intelligent life coming from non-intelligent life and self-aware life. So they say come from non-self-aware life. So they won't accept it. But that's the evidence we have today. That's where it points today. Scientists were honest. They would have to say, yes, that's where it points today. You can have all the faith that you want, but in the future, it's going to be something else. But when you present evidence at a trial, you can't say, oh, no, judge, that doesn't work because sometime in the future, we're going to produce better evidence. No, you're going to be judged on the evidence you have right there, not on what you say you might have in the future. So that's where the science actually points. That's where the observation of the material world actually points. Unless you can find a problem with that.
Yeah, no,
I can't, but I'm biased.
I mean, of course. And I could definitely see someone who's not inclined to think, they would, I guess, probably say that, well, you're making this leap to the immaterial, and that sort of thing. I guess that's another whole, I mean, maybe this would be a good place to sort of shift a little bit. But I was thinking to sort of ask you about, one of the challenges certainly about communicating with students or communicating with anybody about this sort of thing is getting someone to consider the possibility of like a spiritual plane or a spiritual world, I think sort of in popular speaking about things, people maybe feel kind of okay saying, okay, if there was a God, but when you start talking about things like, are there angelic beings? Are there demonic beings? It's like, whoa, that's really kooky. Where do you come? So that almost seems to be kind of like a barrier, like that there's a spiritual level to ourselves, or that there's a spiritual level to the world that we live in. I don't know, how do you talk about that, or how do you, I don't know, what are some ways of showing the spiritual world? I mean, obviously some of the things that we're talking about here as far as morality and so on sort of steps into that, but is there a way that you encourage folks to think about the spiritual world?
Yeah. First, going back to what you said just a second ago. Yes, you could say it's a leap to go to the immaterial, but it's the only place to go with the evidence we have now, unless you're going to hope that maybe someday there'll be evidence down the road. But yeah, I think, a lot of people want to put the cart before the horse. When you have people who don't believe they can know who God is, how do you tell them about demons and angels and so on? They're not even going to believe you if you tell them who the God is. How are you going to go past that? So I have a lot of people telling me, well, you should just tell them about Jesus. Just tell them about Jesus. And I'd love to be able to do that. But it's BB's off a tank because they don't believe you can know what you're saying. So I try to stay within their realm, what they would think and believe right now, and challenge that and go from there. And then when somebody's willing to go from there, now I do, though, on the other hand, whenever I say, look, you have to seek for God, he has to reveal it to you, he has to enlighten you, I do then say you always have to be looking for truth, because there are other spirits out there that will try to, deceive you. But God is truth. I think we went over this a little bit last time, but God is truth. And so if you're always seeking for God, you never stop seeking for truth, you'll eventually find the truth, which is God. But if you're looking just to have something that you want to be true, then you're not seeking for truth, and then you allow these other spirits to come in and deceive you. Plus, if you do get deceived, even if you're looking for truth, deception's not that great. You'll eventually come across it. So I do, you'll eventually see the deception. So I do say that under that context, but most contexts, at least students right now, they're not ready for that. They you know, they may think, okay, that's nice or whatever, but they can't even come to the conclusion that they can know who the God is, how they're supposed to, know that there's angels and demons and so on. So I find a lot of people telling me to put the cart before the horse, but try to tell them, look, there's sowers and there's reapers. What I do out there is mostly sowing, trying to disabuse them of their beliefs, trying to show them where their beliefs fail. And sometimes, like the other day, I was doing some of that, right? I was saying, I'm doing the whole C.S. Lewis thing, if you're gonna deal with Jesus, he's either a loon or he's God. There's no in between, right? You can't say, oh, he's a great man, a great teacher, a great prophet, just a little off on the God thing. You can't be just a little off on the God thing. So if you've got a guy walking around Israel saying he's God, well, he either is or he lost it somewhere down the line. So I do once in a while throw something like that in there. Or you can't say, well, like the Muslims try to say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. His disciples put that in later on. Why? That makes his message easier. Say, here he is, a prophet. It's easy to say the prophet said this. Now you're saying he's God. That's going to make that easier to stomach for people. There's no way that if you wanted a prophet's message to get out, you'd start calling him God. That makes it so much more difficult to get that out. So none of that makes sense. It's either he's God, as he said, or he's a loon. The problem is, and this is why the Muslims have to say what they say and others say what they say, is that when you look at what Jesus said and you look at what he did, he doesn't come off as a loon. Even if you don't believe what he did, even if you just look at what he says, he doesn't come off as a loon. I've known some people in my years that have said they're God or they're Jesus. They're loons. And everybody knows they're loons. They act like a loon, but Jesus didn't act like that. So, you have to make that decision. So I will do that once in a while. But other than that, it's really putting the cart before the horse. Okay. In my estimation. I could be wrong, but that's my estimation.
No, I that's interesting. I think probably, like I said, I'm sort of the person that's on the other side of being disabused of his previous conceptions. And so that was really helpful. I'm just thinking, I guess, I can remember thinking about things like in the 90s, if you remember the Psychic Friends Network, and they, you call up Dionne Warwick and you talk, and my general thought on that is like, oh, well, that's just a bunch of just silliness or nonsense, or they're being suggestive, but looking back on it, I could say, well, perhaps they were opening themselves up to some sort of spirit or something, and certainly you can see it within, if we're talking about, Muhammad, when he received his revelation, it's possible that he was encountering some other spirits, so it's something that I guess I can look back on. But I guess I think you're right in terms of it's probably a bit much to think of. I don't know. I just wanted to ask you about that, just in terms of like whether you thought it would be a helpful thing to kind of try to crack through, or to try if your pathway was a little different. That's kind of.
No, if somebody asked me directly, if they said, what do you think? I don't know. I've never heard a psychic question asked recently, but somebody said, what do you think about these psychics or whatever? Yeah, I'd say they're either making it up or they're in contact with a demon. Or do you think there's ghosts? Or do you think there's aliens? Aliens is the big one.
Oh yeah, that's right.
I said, yeah, it's just demons pretending to be, because demons, from the fathers, demons can make themselves into like even huts or houses. Right? They get a bunch of them together and they make what looks like a house or whatever. And I forget the exact story that I read, but I think it may have been in Father Seraphim Rose's book, Religion and what is it? Orthodoxy and Religion of the Future. And, so they could easily make themselves out to look like a spaceship or whatever. Yeah. So that's, they say, what do you think about aliens? Well, I think they're demons. I think they're real. I don't think they're all made up. Some of them are real, but they're demons. So on those sorts of questions, then you give the answer, but trying to convince people that there's demons and angels and fallen angels and whatever before they even realize who the God is or even believe that you can know. And they're so secularized. So, I mean, I don't know if you're in touch with this generation, but they're so indoctrinated with secularism, so indoctrinated with materialism that, you know, it's just, it would be, for me, it would be a waste of time, but maybe not for somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess that I think would probably make sense as a, you know, that's probably a conversation that happens down the line, or a personal question, like you said, as opposed to, certainly, you know, there are more pressing things to focus on, I'm sure. So
yeah, and yeah, and that's the big one, and the morals are big, because they're right there. That you're reaching to where they are, and you're trying to say, look what you're being taught. You know, does this have any chance of being true? And just keep pounding it and pounding it and pounding it and pounding it until maybe somebody starts to break a little bit, because it's so indoctrinated. It's going to be worse with the next generation. You know, because the left, you know, the secularists, they're smart. They go into these lower grades and they teach them from the time they come out of the womb, basically, and from the time they enter into elementary school. And by the time they hit, you know, college and so on, they're so indoctrinated that it's really difficult to get through to them. So you just have to pray and say what you're going to say, and pray and hope that God can break through the mess. But I wouldn't tell anybody, don't say those things. Say whatever you think you should say. I'm just saying why I don't really major on those things.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that we probably, even as Christians, we sort of speak carefully about anyway, because there's only, I don't know, there's caution there, you know. Well, do we want to, so our friend sent us a couple of emails from the Penn State Spiritual Center. Do we want to look at those briefly to sort of paint the picture of the culture at Penn State? Is that
sure?
Okay. So just a little background. Let me see about sharing my screen. Let's see. All right. Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So the Pasquarelli Spiritual Center.
I can't see the what I can see the what you have up, the writing up top, but I can't see the actual, you know, the picture or whatever. Yeah. So that the Astrology Lounge.
Yeah. So so this is sort of an attempt to just sort of look at the general culture at Penn State a little bit. So this was an email sent out. There are just so many things that are sort of stacked into this. What's your general view of the organized spiritual, I don't know, education or goings on at Penn State?
Well, I told our friend that's what we call it, the Antichrist Pasquarelli Spiritual Center, because, you know, there used to be just Christian, and now it's everything under the sun, including atheists. There were atheists there that had an official atheist, you know, room or whatever that was theirs to, you know, office or whatever. So yeah, that's the way it is these days. It's every spirituality under the sun. And he sent us another one you might bring up later, whatever, about oneness Pentecostalism or whatever, which is a heresy from Christianity. But the reason I say it's the Antichrist Spiritual Center is because, more than likely, in my view, and I could be wrong, but some of the fathers have said this, that the religion of the Antichrist, before he claims to be God, is going to be ecumenism. So he's going to basically say, all religions are equally right. I've heard this for decades. And we talked about this a little bit last time. All religions are equally right. They all point to the same God. They're all going to the same paradise. So just believe in whatever religion you want and realize you're all going to the same God. And then eventually he puts himself as that God. And this is part of that. It's all the same. It's getting people ready to accept that, and they already do accept the idea, you know, that all religions are the same. I had a conversation with somebody today about that very same thing. And he was like, yeah, I believe in God, don't know who he is, but all religions are pointing to the same God. So like we said last time, you know, that may be true with others, but it's not true with Christianity.
Hmm.
You know, when it comes to the Trinity and the incarnation, Christianity stands apart as separate, because no other religion has three persons, one God. They all say, no, God's not three persons, one God. They don't, none of them say the Son of God became man in the person of Jesus. None of them say Jesus is the only way of salvation. So, you know, Christianity says that. All religions say Christianity is wrong. Christianity stands out as separate. It's either right or wrong, but you can't fit it in with all the other world religions. And you might think, this is not proof by any means, but you might think that if God was going to have one true religion, it would be like that.
Hmm.
Right. So, but anyhow, so yeah, that's what they've been preparing people for decades.
Yeah.
You know, whatever spirituality is out there is just as good as every other spirituality. It comes along with, you can't know who God is. Can't know who God is, then all this quote spiritual stuff is all the same. Doesn't really matter.
Absolutely. Yeah, and of course, just looking at this, this is an email that was forwarded to us. There's all sorts of all sorts of things, sort of political and otherwise, they're kind of stacked on top of this. So this fella who is inviting people to the spiritual center for the astrology lounge. So astrology, getting your sign and your horoscope and all that kind of stuff. Again, which is just as valid as anything else. You know, so he has his pronouns, of course. This quote, I had to look this up. This is actually a Norse poem. So his sort of byline quote is from a Viking poem, essentially. And then there's some very nice things said about how Penn State sits on, or the original homelands of various tribes. It's fine. Not sure what that necessarily has to do with the spiritual life there. And then
All those tribes have their own spirituality, I guess, right?
well, I guess that's right. Yep. And then of course the for some reason it also trails off into Penn State having being a campus with over 35,000 female students and students with uterus of reproductive age. Not that those things are the same, apparently. Anyway, so just lots of really kind of I would say amusing, maybe distressing things packed into it. But then, yeah, so in inviting everybody for an exploration of astrology, how it's used, and what to know about the signs. Again, like you said, it's um, just as valid as anything else, right?
And you know, in Christianity, we believe that the gods of the nations are demons.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's not just, it is spirituality, but as we were trying to say earlier, it's spirituality of demons. So any religion that's not Christianity, it's not neutral. Right. It's been started by demons, because the only thing they care about, demons are fallen angels that rebelled against God way back when. And all they care about is you don't become Christian. That's all they care about. So they'll help you create any religion under the sun, whether it sounds good, whether it sounds reasonable, whether it's kooky or whatever, it doesn't matter. As long as they're getting people away from Jesus, they'll do it. So all these, even the gods of those, you know, Indian tribes, they were all demons. They weren't gods, they were demons. The gods of the pagans are demons. The god of Islam is demons. You know, all these are demons. Even with Judaism, getting them away from the Trinity and to the one person, one God, that's the work of the demons. It's not the work of God. So you've got God who's with the Christians, and everything else is it's not human, it's not neutral, it's demonic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's you know, like one thing that is sort of backtracking just a little bit to this idea of like an understanding of the spiritual world. You know, so much of what you do, of course, is to try to say, look, think about these things. But it's not that someone has to be captured by demonic forces to be led astray. They just need to be distracted by anything, you know, with the appeal of some other false religion or entertainment, or you know, anything that's going to keep them from seeking the truth, essentially. You know, it makes, like you said, it makes no difference to the demonic forces that whether it's whether, as long as someone's not Christian, then that's the goal, you know. And so whether they're deeply entrenched in some false religion or just completely indifferent to it, kind of doesn't matter.
No, the demons hate God, and they know they can't get to him. They know he loves us, so they hate us. And they try to take us to hell because they know that or that hurts God, I guess. You know,
Mhm.
so that's what they're trying to do, and they don't care how they do it. Like you said, it can be any way. You can be a sports fanatic and forget about God. You can be an arts type person and forget it. As long as you're forgetting about God, as long as you're not coming to Jesus, that's all they care about.
All right. So let me flip over to this other email. This one's kind of interesting. Same introduction, same person sending out the email. It's fine. And then this is basics on belief, interfaith literacy chats. And this one in particular, it's oneness theology within Christianity, right? And so even that is using, it has the look of Christianity for sure. You know, those folks would definitely identify themselves as Christians, and yet they're identifying with a clearly heretical view within Christianity.
Yeah, oneness theology is basically, Arianism or something like that. It's basically saying there's a Trinity. I think in oneness Pentecostalism, they basically say there's one person in the Godhead, and sometimes he acts as the Father, sometimes he acts as the Son, sometimes he acts as the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
So it's it's a heresy, a Christian heresy. But fortunately, I heard only maybe 5 people showed up.
Uh-huh.
And what the problem is with things like this, you end up in sola scriptura if you try to go against them. They have their scriptures, what they're going to interpret in a certain way. You have yours. You're going to interpret each other's differently, and it's really a no-win situation. So that's why we have the fathers, though.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem of getting away from the fathers and the saints. These are the ones that were close to God. These were the ones that kept the beliefs from the centuries, from the first century till today. And so if you just try to stay with sola scriptura, you can go anywhere. This isn't even that bad for some of the things I've seen.
Absolutely.
But you can go anywhere. It's the fathers of the church, it's the saints, it's those who are holy, those who are close to God, that can keep you on the straight and narrow. Otherwise, like you see in these things, you can go anywhere.
Absolutely. All right. So that was just a little peek into the Pasquarelli Center, Pasquarella Center, and the general
Antichrist Pasquarella Center.
That's right. And the general, let's say, spiritual culture at Penn State, and that's probably not unlike probably most major universities, I would imagine.
Because they used to have, and they still do, I guess, Eisenhower Chapel back in the day, and that was purely Christian. That was it. And then when they built this, then of course it got into the whole, everything. And but that's the culture, and that's the way things are going, and that's why we as Christians have to hold the line.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a little over an hour. Any closing remarks or any other thoughts?
I think we covered this pretty well.
Okay.
There was at least one other thing I could have put in with the scientists, with the atheists and so on, but I think we can let that go for another day.
Okay. Yeah, I think it would probably be worthwhile just to maybe as a larger topic in the future, just sort of talk about, I don't know, science at large, because it is kind of there's a lot of things that connect to that. And it's definitely part of the kind of faith of our culture for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it used to be religion was on the top of the ladder.
Mm-hmm.
When they knocked that off, they had to put something else on top. So it used to be when you had a life question, you went to the religious leaders. If there was a consensus, that's what you went with. Now you go to the scientific leaders. They're at the top of the heap. And if there's a consensus among the scientific leaders, that's what you go with. So that people tell me, well, we're so much better off these days. We just used to do whatever the religious leaders did just because they told us to do it. We never questioned them. So yeah, well, what do you think you're doing today? You're doing whatever the scientific leaders tell you, and you're not questioning them. You're not looking at their funding. You're not looking at their experiments. You're not doing all that. If there's a consensus among the scientists, you're acting the same way as people in the past acted about the consensus of the religious leaders.
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, so we'll have to dig into that sometime in the not too distant future. Anything coming up this week?
I mean, I got a lot of church this week, being Lent, and we've got the Annunciation. Right? Is that right? Annunciation coming up Saturday. Friday night and Saturday. And on campus, actually, I do have an interview I'm doing. I don't know why I'm saying this because I don't know how anybody could get to it if they wanted to. But Penn State has some sort of TV thing they're doing, and if they put it on YouTube, but I'm supposed to be doing that tomorrow. I don't know anything about that really. Other than that, things are just a normal week, I think.
Very good. All right. Well, let's see. I guess a couple final closing things to say then. Last time we put out an email, so we're going to kind of update that email. It's now podcast at thewillardpreacher.com. So if someone has questions or thoughts or whatever, want to contact us, send it that way. Podcast at thewillardpreacher.com. And yeah, so we're just kind of having these conversations. We're doing our best, I think, to faithfully represent Orthodox Christianity. And if we drift away, then that's our fault. And we're if we drift away from that, then that's on us. So, but that's what we're trying to be faithful to, ultimately. So,
it's between us and the church. You go to the church.
That's it. And
hopefully we'll be faithful to it. But if we do happen to make a mistake, we'll always go with the church.
That's right. Absolutely. Well, I guess we'll sign off then, Gary. And
okay, it's been fun.
Absolutely, I've enjoyed it, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Good. Sounds good.
All right. Have a good night.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.